Guys, welcome to Better Bachelor. My name is Joker with a face for radio and a voice for print. Turns out there's an article I want to read that a new study, and this came out here in 2023, last year, Personality and Social Psychology. Turns out they did implicit bias studies, which is it's a very quick way of testing to see if there's an implicit bias without too much thinking. In other words, they quickly show a series of photos. They do various other studies to discover if there's bias towards various people. And come to find out, a lot of the groups we've been told about that society is against, turns out a lot of it's a lie. But the one that isn't a lie is that everybody is against men, surprisingly enough. Before we read the main story here, I just want to read this quote very quickly. It says, we know they're lying. They know we lie. Or excuse me, we know they're lying. They know we know they're lying, but they keep lying to us, and we keep pretending to believe them. This is a quote either attributed to both Elena Gorkova and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The quote suggests that there's a level of dishonesty in society where people are aware of the lies being told but continue to pretend to believe them. Now, the reason why I wanted to read that particular quote is because I think a lot of women today know that it's a lie, that men are toxic and men are bad and men are evil and men make more money and men control the world and blah, 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 blah. I think they know that's a lie, but I think they go with it because it helps them. It makes things makes things a little bit easier for them to get what they want. And we know, at least throughout society, that women are more manipulative and they use covert actions to get what they want, where men use more overt actions to get what they want. In other words, men will actually confront the issue, which might be two men don't like each other, they get into a fight, and one guy ends the other one. Or there's, duels at dawn with swords or the one-shot musket or whatever. But women will quietly slip in poison, or they'll wait till their man's asleep and then, off him or throw a pot of boiling water on him or something like that. Well, I have a story here that I'm going to read that covers that pretty accurately, I would say. So the story I'm going to read today is from the City Journal. It's written by John Tierney, and it's called The Misogyny Myth. Women aren't discriminated against in 21st century America, but men increasingly are. We know this, and I think they know this. But once again, they're going to ignore a lot of this because, hey, if you can be winning and still accuse the losing team of cheating or doing poorly, it makes, and everybody agrees with you, it makes your win all that much easier. And then after a while, it's not even a challenge. Let me zoom this up a little bit so everybody can read along. Misogyny is supposedly rampant in modern society, but where exactly does it lurk? For decades, researchers have hunted for evidence of overt discrimination against women, as well as subtler varieties like systemic sexism or implicit bias. But instead of detecting misogyny, they keep spotting something else. Consider a new study that is one of the most sophisticated efforts to analyze implicit bias. Previous researchers typically look for it by measuring split-second reactions to photos of faces, how long it takes to associate each face with a positive or negative attribute. Some studies reported that whites were quicker to associate black faces with negative attributes, but those experiments often involved small samples of college students. For this study, a team of psychologists led by Paul Connor of Columbia University recruited a nationally representative sample of adults and showed them more than just faces. The participants saw full-body photos of men and women of different races and ages, dressed in outfits ranging from well-tailored suit and blazers to scruffy hoods, T-shirts, and tank tops. Who was biased against whom? The researchers found no consistent patterns by race or age. The participants were quicker to associate negative attributes with people in scruffier clothes, but that bias was fairly small. Only one strong and consistent bias emerged. Participants in every category, men and women of all races, ages, and social classes were quicker to associate positive attributes with women and negative attributes with men. You know, when you go back through history and you think of the men that sacrificed themselves during World War II, or you think of the men that built this country, or the forefathers that, at least here in the United States, wrote our Constitution and pulled away from the British for a 3% tax, it tends to give you a pretty positive feeling. These were men that were strong, that were decisive, that took very large risk. Many of them lost their families and their loved ones and all their money and their homes to stand up for something they believed in. So what happened between the positive things that we used to think about men, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago versus now? So many times I do videos on laws that are unfair to men and, all the bias that are in things. And people kind of say, yeah, but just ignore it. It's no big deal. Or, yeah, we kind of know this is coming. And we can expect it, but we're adults. We're men who've already kind of made our way. We've had the trials and tribulations of life, and we kind of know what it's about. We kind of have the trials, and we've been tested by fire going through life, and so we kind of know what it's all about. But what about the young generation coming up today? If you look at young men wanting to delete themselves, young men wanting to become women, because they think women have an easier life or are treated better. Certainly, if you're part of the LDHD TV community, you're treated very, very well. So a lot of young men are saying, hey, you know what? If I'm going to be blamed for all the world's ills, I'm going to switch teams, so to speak. And it's having an effect, not necessarily to the older generations, but to the younger ones coming up. And much of this damage, I think, is going to be permanent. So what's interesting about this study is they found that the association came between clothing. In other words, if somebody's dressed scruffy, or maybe they're dirty or they look homeless, maybe you think there's more of a risk they're going to commit a crime. They might steal from you, they might mug you, they might break into a building, or they might just be a kind of a grungy homeless person that kind of gives you the ick. That versus a suit is really the only bias they found, other than everything that leaned negatively towards men. That's pretty huge if you think about it, which means the black versus white, or the black versus Latino, or black versus Asian, or Latino versus white, all that really is kind of debunked. But the one that is true is that men are largely looked down upon. They said participants were guilty of not misogyny, but the opposite, misandry, a bias against men. The study merely measured unconscious reactions, so it didn't prove that they would discriminate against men. The many critics of implicit bias research maintain that measures of people's unconscious isms bear scant relation to their conscious behavior. But when it comes to detecting misandry, we don't need to probe the unconscious to find it. There's overwhelming evidence of conscious, blatant, and widespread discrimination against boys and men in modern societies. And that is true. You can say, hey, you know something? Just because somebody might have an instinctive reaction of be more supportive of men, more supportive of women and less supportive of men, or trust women more, or give more good feelings toward women and more bad feelings toward men, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily act upon it. But like he mentions, we see them acting upon it. Again, in aforementioned commercials and movies, etc. Right? We know they're acting upon it. They said if you haven't heard of this evidence, it's because of the well-documented misandrous bias in the public discussion of gender issues. Scholars, journalists, politicians, and activists will lavish attention on small, badly flawed studies if it purports to find bias against women, but they'll ignore or worse, suppress the wealth of solid research showing the opposite. 3 decades ago, psychologists identified the women are wonderful effect based on research showing that both sexes tend to rate women more positively than men. This effect has been confirmed repeatedly. Women get higher ratings than men for intelligence as well as competence, and it's obvious in popular culture. Many of you that watch my channel, we might even be the opposite, saying, well, that's actually the opposite. Usually it's men that make the better decisions nowadays. Or at least maybe they've always made better decisions because they come from a more logical, rational place versus emotional, reactive. And when it comes down to situations like that, if a pilot passes out on your airplane, who do you want? A woman screaming at the top of her lungs saying, I got this, while she's crying, grabbing the yoke and flustered, contacting the tower? Or would you rather have a guy that's calm and says, okay, I took a couple of lessons or whatever, let me sit down and I'll see if I figure this out. Now, here's what's interesting. If the roles were reversed, would you rather have a guy that's crying and screaming, oh, we're all going down, but I'll try to do my best? Or would you rather have a woman say, I took a couple of lessons, I think I can do this, let me sit down, I'll talk to the tower, we'll work through it? Most people would say, I want the calm person, man or woman. I want the logical, calm, rational person versus the one that's a hot mess and emotional. Well, what do we know about women? They're usually the ones that are the hot mess, emotional ones. That's all I'm saying about that. So yes, we do know that it's probably the opposite of what the actual, this women are wonderful effect. We know it's the opposite probably, that the women get the higher ratings for men in intelligence as well as competence, but in truth, it's probably the opposite. They say toxic masculinity and testosterone poisoning are widely blamed for many problems, but you don't hear much about toxic femininity or estrogen poisoning. Who criticizes femsplaining or pretends to believe all men? If the patriarchy really did rule our society, the stock father character in television sitcoms would not be a doofus dad like Homer Simpson, and commercials wouldn't keep showing wives outsmarting their husbands. When's the last time you saw a TV husband getting something right? Smug misandry has been box office gold for Barbie, which delights in writing off men as hapless romantic partners, leering jerks, violent buffoons, and dim-witted tyrants who ought to let women run the world. And, he's kind of validating what I'm talking about in modern culture. Numerous studies have shown that both sexes care more about harms to women than men. Men get punished more severely than women for the same crime, and crimes against women are punished more severely. And crimes against women are punished more severely than crimes against men. Institutions openly discriminate against men in hiring and promotion policies, and a majority of men as well as women favor affirmative action programs for women. This is men working against their own best interests. Why? Because they're shamed if they look out for themselves. If a man says, hey, you know what, right now colleges are graduating women a lot more than men, maybe we need to take some of those women's programs and turn them into men's programs to try to get guys back up even with the women. There would be screaming abound. Everybody would be reeing because you're removing a woman's program to give it to a man, even though statistically and numbers show it's the men that are struggling. I have another little article I can pull up, I'll just briefly touch on at the end of this, that kind of proves it. The establishment, or the education establishment, has obsessed for decades about the shortage of women in some science and tech disciplines, but few worry about males badly trailing by just about every other academic measure from kindergarten through graduate school. By the time boys finish high school, if they do, they're so far behind that many colleges lower admission standards for males, a rare instance of pro-male discrimination. Though it's not motivated by a desire to help men, admission directors do it because many women are loath to attend a college if the gender ratio is too skewed. So basically, they're lowering the scores so more men can get in, so ultimately they can get more women in, ironically. Gender disparities generally matter only if they work against women. In computing its global gender gap, the much-quoted annual report, the World Economic Forum, has explicitly ignored male disadvantages. If men fare worse on a particular dimension, a country still gets a perfect score for equality on that measure. Prodded by the federal Title IX law banning discrimination in schools, educators have concentrated on eliminating disparities in athletics, but not in other extracurricular programs, which mostly skew female. The fact that there are now 3 female college students for every 2 males is of no concern to the White House Gender Policy Council. Its national strategy on gender equality and equity doesn't even mention boys' struggles in school, instead focusing exclusively on new ways to help female students get further ahead. You know, what's interesting with all of this happening now is if you look at colleges, a lot of the women are getting the higher educations. They're getting the higher paying jobs. They're getting the jobs that require more brain power and more degree as it is. But it doesn't necessarily make them smarter. As a matter of fact, if you talk to many college students today, including the women, they're not very bright. Colleges are just kind of cranking through a lot of these young people just to make money. It's not really about teaching education much anymore. So in the long run, as much as we might be screaming, holy cow, this is horrible, society will probably collapse, I don't think it actually will. Because when things really get rough, who's still going to be needed? The farmers, the manual labor, the wrenchers, the guys that roll up their sleeves and do the elbow work. You're not going to need Karen in accounting as much as you're going to need John, the building maintenance guy. Because if you get a spring in a leak, or the toilet doesn't work, or the electricity goes out, that's a big problem for your business. If Karen, the receptionist, or even Karen, the senior executive manager of blah, 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 you might have to work around a little bit because of the work she normally directs, but upper management isn't needed in a lot of cases. A lot of companies do without it. So it'll be really interesting to see as these jobs slough off and we go deeper into a recession and things get bad. It'll be interesting to see who really suffers the most. Will it be the men or the women? And the men don't have $200,000, loans they need to pay back. So as much as I'm concerned that males aren't going to college at the same rate as women, in many ways, guys are saying, you know what, I'm not really getting anything out of college. I don't want to come out of college with a $200,000 or $300,000 loan when I can go apprentice, as a laborer and make very good money and not have that huge bill to pay back. They say, of course, females in the past did suffer from outright discrimination, but most American institutions eliminated those barriers at least 40 years ago. Women have been a majority of college graduates since 1982 and dominate by many other key measures. They not only live longer than men, but also benefit from a higher share of federal funding for medical research. They're much less likely to be injured or ended on the job or self-delete. They receive the lion's share of Social Security and other entitlement payments, while men pay the lion's share of taxes. They decide how to spend most of the family income. Women initiate most divorces and are much likelier to win custody of children. While the men are ahead in some ways, politicians love to denounce the gender pay gap and the glass ceiling supposedly limiting women. These disparities have been shown to be largely, if not entirely, due to personal preferences and choices, not discrimination. And we've talked about that, so I won't rehash that again, but I've done several videos on that. Yet most people still believe the myth of pervasive misogyny at the social psychologists Corey Clark and Bo Weingard concluded in Quillette after surveying the research literature on gender bias, noting that a Google Scholar search for misogyny yielded 114,000 results, while a search for misandry yielded only 2,340. They write, "We suspect this difference in interest in misogyny over misandry reflects not the relative prevalence of each type of prejudice, but rather greater concern for the well-being of women than men. All the arguments, anecdotes, and data forwarded to support the narrative that we live in an implicably misogynistic society, in fact, may be evidence of precisely the opposite." This is one of the things we as men know, right? That we are loved for our utility, what we provide, what we bring to the table, what we give to society. Women aren't. Women are lauded for just being women. So I think a lot of this doesn't really come to a surprise for most of us men. But for the younger generation, how are these men going to turn out? Are they going to follow the strong, stoic men? Are they going to get strength and perseverance from somebody? Or are they going to fall by the wayside? Well, seeing that, most kids are raised by single moms and the educators are women and the movies and everybody else kind of puts down men, no wonder a large number of men are now saying, hey, you know what? Instead of being a guy, I can now, go the Mulvaney route and become part of the LGHD TV community, and say I'm a girl. And then not only am I not punished for being a man, but I'm actually ahead of some of the women because now I'm stunning and brave and I identify as a woman, and that's a protected class. So I think a lot of this is going to make more young men decide to become young women just so they can get a leg up on the actual women. And ironically, that means that men are going to be ahead of the women again. They just don't see it, unfortunately. He says, yes, the misogyny myth persists because both sexes want to believe it. Our greater concern for women's well-being is presumably an innate bias that evolved because it helps the species multiply. From a reproductive standpoint, individual males are expendable, but females are not. Men are expected to sacrifice their lives defending women in every culture, from hunter-gatherer bands to modern nations like Ukraine, which allowed millions of women to flee the Russian invasion and required all men under 60 to stay and fight. Part of the reasoning of this is both cultural and innate, I think. Because if you think about it, I know myself as a man, and I've mentioned this a couple times before, but I think it bears repeating. I find as a man, if I see a woman getting beat up by, another guy, or I see a puppy or a dog or an animal or a child, something that is weak or weaker than what the aggressor upon it, men's natural instinct is to jump in and defend. Women do not have that. They will watch. They'll watch with curiosity. They'll be glad it's not happening to them. They'll run away. But very rarely do they have the actual instinct to go in. And I think this is lizard brain stuff. Because if you think about it, if there's a tribe of 10 women and 10 men, and 10 women go out to the field and only one comes back, you got one woman and 10 men, she can only bear one child for 9 months. And then maybe she has to recover, we'll say, 3 months. She could have a kid a year. Well, in just a couple of years, after she's out of childbearing, maybe she could have 10 kids. That's not very good for the tribe. But if 10 men went out hunting and only one came back, but there were 10 women, well, each one, that man could be with each one of those women several times. And instead of just having 10 kids, instead of having one kid at a time for 10 years, you could have 10 kids for 10 years. That's 100 kids. Now, granted, those kids couldn't interact because that's how you end up with the British. That's just a joke on the blue bloods of Europe. That's just a joke. Don't take me serious, my Brits. I love you. But you understand what I'm saying. But then they could interact with another, and society would continue on. So I think it is innate. But the problem is, again, when you disparage men for trying to do their best, and then the women don't want them, well, what are you getting now? Now you're getting 10 women that only want to sleep with one guy. So the other 9, instead of going out and getting ended out in nature while they were hunter-gathering, well, now that one woman, or the 10 women are only sleeping with one guy anyway, and the other 9 are kind of like, I got nothing going on, man. I'm just gonna do my own thing. They say the instinct to protect women has been essential for societies to survive, but it has also made us easy prey for modern industry of academics, journalists, activists, lobbyists, and bureaucrats who falsely blame sexism for any gender gap that doesn't favor women. The misogyny myth has served the interests of the diversity industry, but it is enormously damaging to the rest of society, women as well as men. In 2016, the Australian national government launched a rigorous quest to combat its own misogyny as part of its gender equality strategy. It brought in Harvard economist Michael J. Hiscox to address the disparity in the government workforce. Women held 59% of the jobs, but only 49% of the executive positions. Now, granted, there is a 10% gap there. What's the difference? A lot of women don't want to put in the hours, and I haven't read all the way through this, so if I say something and then I repeat it, or they repeat it, I apologize. But these are stats and stories that have been around forever. A lot of the women don't want to put in the time and make the sacrifice to become CEO or upper executive. You have to work a lot of hours. You have to make a lot of like personal sacrifice to get that done. And a lot of times the women won't, where the men will, because the men have a family they want to take care of. And they say, hey, you know what, I'm going to put myself through a little bit of pain so my kids and my wife can be comfortable and live a good life. Because, again, that's kind of in men. It's not in women's, heads, really. Hiscock's team of behavioral scientists tested an approach inspired by a famous study of musicians auditioning to join symphony orchestras in America. It had reported that in a blind auditions with a screen hiding the musicians from judges, women were much more successful than in open auditions. Hiscock's researchers adapted this gender-blind study for a randomized controlled trial involving more than 2,100 managers at Australian agencies. Each manager saw a group of resumes and shortlisted the most promising candidates for an executive position. Some saw resumes with no names, others saw the same resumes with either male or female names. The experiment produced an unintended consequence, as the researchers ruefully noted in their report. Going blind to see more clearly, when managers evaluated a resume with a female name like Wendy Richards, they were more likely to shortlist it than if they saw the same resume with no name. And they were less likely to shortlist it if the name was Gary Richards. Australia's public servants were clearly guilty of bias against men, and that was just fine with the architects of the gender equality strategy. The crucial lesson from this experiment, Hiscock's team concluded, was for the government to avoid gender-blind hiring procedures while seeking new ways to discriminate against men. It remains clear that more work needs to be done to address the problems of gender inequality. So what's interesting here is that the fact that if it had a woman's name, she got shortlisted. In other words, very preferential treatment, more so than if it had no name. So if it's a woman, best of all. If there's no name on it, well, that's second best. If it's a guy's name, that's dead last. And of course they say, well, we don't see any gender bias here. Everything seems to be fine, even though there was gender bias. But it was against the men, not the women, so they didn't care. And that's what's going to throw everything off. The report of anti-male bias evoked little interest among journalists or academics. According to Google Scholar, it has averaged barely 5 citations annually in the academic literature. Nothing like the impact of the orchestra study, which has averaged more than 100 citations annually since appearing in 2000 and become a perennial favorite in the media and at diversity conferences. Its conclusions were welcomed so eagerly that scholars ignored the contradictory data in the paper for nearly 2 decades. It was not until 2019 that 2 analysts outside the diversity industry, a data scientist and a Columbia University statistician, noted a problem. Overall, the female musicians did comparatively worse in the blind auditions than in the open auditions. It was only by fixing on a subset of the musicians that the researchers could identify an advantage for women. But this effect wasn't consistent, and the findings were not statistically significant. These limitations were acknowledged by the authors and described in 2019 by Christiana Hoff Sommers in the Wall Street Journal. Since then, the orchestra study has kept racking up citations at an even higher rate, more than 200 in just 1 year. So even though it was flawed, it was small, and it had some issues with it, it's still cited because it pushes the narrative that they want it to do. But any study that goes counter to that narrative is ignored, even though the data might actually be better. Are we surprised by this? Of course not. We know that's how this is going to go. And this is and part of this is because, number one, women are getting in positions of power and they're helping out other women. I get that. But the second thing is that now it's in politics, it's in upper education, and they keep going along with this kind of belief, even if it hurts men, even if it's a detriment to men, because women are now kind of being selfish and saying, hey, you know what? Men in the past did it to us. We're going to do it now. And if even if it hurts the men, who cares? Because they once did it to us. It's a little bit of a revenge thing. This, as you can see, is a massive mess. I could read this for another hour. This is a very, very long read. I'm going to stop there. But the one story that I wanted to talk about here, let me flip it over to me while I search through my folders here to find what I wanted to talk about. And this is Mike Rowe. I'm not gonna play the podcast, but this is actually an article. This is based on an article. And so there's an article that supports this, and then there was an interview where they asked Mike Rowe about these questions, if that makes any sense. I just happened to grab the podcast part here. There's the missing 7.2 million male workers. You know what? Sorry about this. Let me pull up the article that I actually want to, because the article is more important but they did interview Mike Rowe about it. So obviously it's a problem. Here's the article that I wanted to pull up. Here we go. Millions of men have dropped out of the workforce, leaving companies struggling to fill jobs. It's a matter of our national identity. This is from January of this year. And it's an interview. I'm not going to play it. A large number of American men of prime working age between 25 and 54 are not working or even looking for work. They say in 1953, 98% of men in that age range had a job or were looking for one. That number has fallen ever since. Today, 7.2 million men have essentially dropped out of the workforce. It's a matter of our national identity, says Mike Rowe, the host of Dirty Jobs on Discovery. Great, he has such a perfect voice for television and radio. I'm genuinely jealous of Mike Rowe's voice. If I had Mike Rowe's voice, I'd probably have 5 billion followers on YouTube. He says it's a giant issue, and by the time we realize how big of an issue it is, we're going to have a hard time turning the temperature down. It's not an issue rooted in the unemployment rate, which is at 3.5%. It's the lowest it's been in 50 years. So what's behind the phenomenon? More jobs than workers. We have more jobs than we have people for. About 1.5 jobs for every one worker, says Jay Timmons, who leads the National Association of Manufacturers, an advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., that represents thousands of manufacturers across the country. Timmons describes all this as a profound problem for the companies he represents. The number one challenge for most of them right now is filling open jobs. I never thought I'd be able to say that, he told CBS News, but now it's kind of all hands on deck. We've got to fill these jobs that are open. More than 770,000 manufacturing jobs are open right now, according to the latest federal count from November. The number has surged in recent years as companies reinvest American-made products or try to. Now, I'll stop here and just put this in here. If you wonder, hey, you know something though, the United States is primarily still mostly white people. And now they're openly not looking for white men, or they're not looking for men, but they want to fill it with, the rainbow of colors and, of course, the rainbow of the LGHDTV groups. You say, well, yeah, but with all these rules in place, there's probably a lot of guys that would like these jobs, but when they're turned down time and time and time again because they're male or they're white or whatever, they just finally say, you know what, forget it. I'll just collect a little bit of unemployment or whatever I can get from the government and screw it, or I'll be homeless or whatever. And so how are they going to eventually fill these roles? Wait for it. Opening the border. Now you've got millions of people coming in. If we're short 7.2 million workers, and in the past 3 or 4 years we've let in 4 million people, there's a whole lot of workers coming across. And for the upper end jobs, a lot of times what they'll do is instead of hiring an American, they'll fill the I think it's HVS1, HBV. Anyway, it's one of the special visas you can get, and they'll hire some Indians or some Asians or somebody to come in and work a tech job, or they'll bring somebody in from wherever. The only reason I used those two countries is because I worked in a technology company, and it was like a third Chinese guys, and it was a third maybe white guys, and it was a third of various other groups of people. I should say maybe a third Indian. It was mostly Indian guys, Asian guys, and white guys. And yeah, there were a little, smattering of other people working these jobs, but those were the majorities. So when they're short on people, and men, these young men growing up today are just like, man, I'm not going to college, or I didn't get accepted to college. I didn't get approved for a student loan because of my skin color. They're not hiring people like me, and they quit. What do? They just reach overseas and import their replacement. And so ultimately, who's getting hurt? Men. Not foreign men, but the American men. They say, with manufacturers' workers earning more than $30 an hour on average, Timmons said the problem is not the pay, but the perception. It used to be dirty, dark, and dangerous, he said. Today it's very sleek. It's very technology-driven. Right, but what's the problem with that? If it's very, very technology-driven and men can't get the degrees, or men aren't getting scholarships, or men aren't getting the loan approvals to get the degrees, or men are showing up and they're being ostracized and called out and being blamed for the world's problem, a lot of guys are going to say, you know what? I don't want to be in college. I don't want to do this. It's not worth it to me. And they bounce. They say not just perception. Carla Trotman, a CEO of Electrosoft, a company outside of Philadelphia that makes circuit boards, said she wishes 45 people worked there instead of 30. But she can't find people to fill the roles, costing the company around $5 million in top-line revenue, as she has been forced to down potential contracts. She suspects a lot of people may be sitting out because of the recent change in how many of us look at work. I think it's fulfillment. I think it's fulfillment. I think it's culture. I think people really want to feel as though they are appreciated. It's an overall feeling of being fed up and it being taken for granted, she added. And this is another problem. You've got the Gen Xers and the Gen Zs, actually not Gen Xers, I'm sorry. You got the Gen Zs and some of the millennials saying, you know what? There was a study I read where something like 60% of young people would not take a job if it meant they couldn't access their phone and check social media all day. 60% of people were more concerned about having access to their social media than getting a great job. It's selfishness. It's, I want to work from home and I want 6 figures and I only want a 32-hour week. And if you don't give it to me, socialism, like screw capitalism. It's the education system and everything they're teaching young people. And so again, we're short on workers. Men have given up. Men are being told no. We got a lot of problems. And when I think us older guys like myself, if a company said to me, if they had a job listing for something and they said, we're looking specifically for these people, I would apply for that job. I would apply only to those jobs. And then when they brought me in for an interview, if they turned me down or if they said anything about I'm not the type of person they're looking for, I'm suing them. I'd sue them. I'm sure I could find a lawyer that would work on, the winnings of the trial if we got it. I don't know if you call that pro bono or what, but I'm sure enough people start suing these companies, something would change. But instead, young people, that's me. I'm a 50-year-old man. Instead, though, a 24-year-old guy's like, you know what? Just screw it. I'm out. And that's where we have our problem. As long as this continues, we're going to have a real problem in society because many of these women that are taking these upper positions and these girl power roles are going to hit their 30s and 40s and realize, you know what, I wish I was a mom. I wish I didn't have to work until, I'm 65. This is a sham. I was lied to. This kind of sucks. I wish I had a dude. But there's no men there that make as much as they do. There's no men that are around anymore. There's no men left that are that they want to date anymore. And so in the end, the women are miserable, the men are miserable, everybody's miserable. And it all boils down to what the media and the governments and these dingbats on the internet are doing to everybody, poisoning the minds of young women and men until we end up in a very miserable place. I've always wished, there's a curse. Supposedly it's a curse. May you live forever. And I think that's a curse because if you were stuck living, for hundreds and hundreds of years, watching the people you love and care about in society change and everything kind of almost like growing and withering and dying in front of your eyes, a lot of people would find that awful. Me personally, I think that'd be kind of awesome, but that's because I'm built kind of weird. But the point is, if you live long enough, you're going to see this world get into a lot of trouble based on where we are today. And as much as I'd like to live forever, there's part of me, a good big part of me, that is glad that I'm 50 today and not 20 today. Because these 20-year-olds are going to have a hard time dealing with this. You think school stress is tough, like high school and peer pressure and being picked on in high school. Well, when you become an adult, it's supposed to get a lot easier. You get a job, you get a girlfriend, you get a home, all that's been taken away. And who's it being taken away from? Governments, printing money, greedy corporations that, there's such an overproduction of workers, with both men and women being in the workforce, that they can get away with offering less money because they say, look, if you don't want this job, someone else will take it. So this is how much we're offering. It's going to be it's a big mess. And I feel bad for you young people that have to go through this. I hope you find a good community of like-minded men to lean upon, and you don't take life too seriously. Because I'll tell you, it might be better wrenching on a diesel engine than working at a Fortune 500 company, especially if we go into a financial crunch. But what's going on now? It's certainly a mess, and you guys got a tough row to hoe, that's for sure. Guys, if you appreciate my work, please give me a thumbs up if you like it. If you don't, thumbs down, and join me over on betterbachelor.locals.com. Great community of guys over there. We've got a summer sale going on, and it's like $38 for a year of support, which is like $3 and something cents a month. I'd really appreciate it if you supported my work over there. And we do movie nights and a bunch of great fun stuff over there. So please join us today. I would appreciate it, and we will see you in the next one.